Welcome to this explainer. Okay, I want you to just picture something with me for a second. Imagine gliding effortlessly through these whimsical, pillowy skies. You're completely surrounded by soft, shifting mists, floating high above a massive, uncharted landscape of floating islands. Today, we're exploring a title that is basically bringing this exact dream into virtual reality. We are looking at a game that genuinely represents a massive paradigm shift in how we actually experience digital worlds. So let's dive right into this, because genuinely original, non-combat VR open-world experiences, they are incredibly uncommon right now. When you look at the major announcements that just came out of the Spring 2026 VR Games Showcase, it really begs a fascinating question. What does it actually feel like to fly an open world in VR using nothing but a standalone headset? It's this hugely ambitious concept that developers have literally been chasing for years, and we finally have a project attempting to pull it off without the safety net of a tethered supercomputer.
If you take a step back and look at the current VR landscape, it's pretty heavily dominated by a very specific type of game. We're super used to claustrophobic corridor shooters and gritty arena combat, right? Think of heavy hitters like Exoshock or Offlies and Rain. And honestly, there's a certain fatigue that can set in with that constant high-stress, violent gameplay. But then you have the vision for Compass. It's betting purely on serene exploration, puzzle navigation, and these peaceful, expansive pastel cloudscapes. It is such a breath of fresh air, basically swapping the assault rifle for a flight stick.
All right, segment one, what is Compass?
When the developers talk about this game, they use language that so beautifully evokes altitude and depth. They talk about navigating pillowy skies and cutting through sweeping mists. It's an open-world piloting adventure set in an uncharted aerial world, where the main objective isn't destruction at all, it's discovery. And Compass isn't just a basic flight simulator. It's actually a dual-mode game. First, you're physically sitting in the cockpit, manually working the flight sticks of an upgradable speeder or cargo ship to navigate some pretty turbulent weather. But then, you actually have to leave the cockpit. For the out-of-cockpit tactile traversal, you use hand grapples to literally swing through ancient ruins, climbing and solving environmental puzzles to restore the sky's auditory harmony. And you're doing all of this while scouting ahead to safely lead a roving airborne caravan.
Now, the logistics behind this release are just as fascinating as the gameplay itself. It's developed by the Canadian studio Trebuchet and co-published with the Creature label, and it's hitting the market on May 28, 2026. What makes this super notable is that it's a really rare multi-platform native release. It's launching on MetaQuest 3 and 3S, as well as SteamVR with a PlayStation VR 2 launch coming a bit later, and because they're leveraging the OpenXR standard, which is basically a universal translator for VR hardware, they're ensuring cross-platform parity. That means the core physical interactions work seamlessly, whether you're running it on a standalone mobile chip or a massive high-end PSVR rig.
But of course, the narrative scaffolding is what actually drives these mechanics forward. You aren't just flying around aimlessly. Your initial mission is to help your crew deliver a mysterious egg to the great incubator. But the inciting incident is this sudden encounter with a formidable beast that scatters your friends completely across the skies. From that moment on, it becomes a desperate search and rescue mission. You have to track down your lost crewmates, like Captain Nim and Schladny the navigator. It's a really brilliant narrative hook because it ensures that every single time you fly to a new island, you have a clear, emotionally resonant goal pushing you forward.
Moving right along to segment 2, the standalone flight question.
So we really have to ask the elephant in the room. Just how demanding is open-world flight rendering on the MetaQuest 3 hardware? Flying requires generating vast draw distances incredibly quickly, which is notoriously difficult for mobile processors. The answer here lies in a mix of hardware muscle and some pretty cutting-edge software. To understand the baseline, we can look at games that already run massive worlds natively on Quest, like Asgard's Wrath 2 and Arcanage. But to achieve that scale during high-speed flight without making players, lose their lunch, Meta recently pushed an update to the Horizon OS introducing a technology called FrameSync. FrameSync synchronizes the rendering engine much more tightly with the headset's display refresh rate. When you combine that new software tech with the Quest 3's powerful Snapdragon XR2 Gen 2 chip, it actively prevents those jarring stutters. It makes high-speed aerial maneuvers and rapid diving actually possible in a complex open-world VR environment.
But here's the thing, FrameSync alone isn't quite enough. You need speed. The Quest 3 supports up to a 120 Hz refresh rate. In the context of a game where you are banking a speeder ship at high altitudes and then physically grappling through ruins, a high refresh rate is just an absolute necessity. It is the absolutely critical factor in mitigating motion sickness during those rapid aerial turns and the out-of-cockpit grapple sequences.
Of course, raw power always has its limits, which is exactly where brilliant art direction has to step in. Check out what analysts are calling the pastel optimization strategy. To manage the standalone rendering budget, the developers deliberately chose a highly stylized aesthetic. They're using simplistic geometries, soft mist, and temporal upsampling, which is essentially using data from past frames to smooth out current ones, to mask visual artifacts like aliasing that naturally happen when you're upresing from a native 1680 by 1760 render resolution. On top of that, they use these high-contrast, carrot-topped islands. Now, this isn't just to look pretty, it naturally draws the player's eye, allowing for super easy visual navigation without having to rely on some cluttered minimap interface.
Which brings us to segment 3, why non-combat VR matters.
To truly understand why this chill, exploration-focused VR represents such a vital paradigm shift, we kind of need to look at the maturation of the industry as a whole, and specifically, the history of the studio behind Compass. If you trace Trebuchet's evolution, it maps almost perfectly to the evolution of VR itself. Back in 2017, they made Prison Boss VR, which was highly tactile, but a completely stationary, claustrophobic room-scale game. Then, by 2021, they experimented with procedural open-world traversal in Winds and Leaves. In 2022, they totally mastered physics-based mechanics in the arena combat game Broken Edge. And now, here in 2026, they are synthesizing all of that knowledge, the tactile interactions, the traversal, and the physics, into Compass, a persistent, boundless, open-world flight adventure.
And look, while other chill exploration games certainly exist, think of great titles like Walkabout Mini Golf, Puzzling Places, or Kayak VR, they often lack a deep, driving narrative. But consider this quote from a recent analytical profile on the game. The Caravan provides the player with a sense of home and community in a vast, otherwise lonely sky, solving the isolation problem often found in large-scale VR. By tethering your progression and your upgrades to a roving community of characters you actually start to care about, Compass injects this vital emotional hook into the serene exploration genre that those other games sometimes miss.
Finally, let's wrap up with segment 4, wishlist, concerns, and verdict. As we drift into our final thoughts here, we really do need to balance the hype by acknowledging the realistic challenges of building an open-world flying adventure on mobile chips. On our wish list, obviously we want that seamless rendering, we want an incredible sense of scale as you dive between islands, and eventually deep PSVR 2 haptics so you can literally feel the flight turbulence in your hands. But the concerns are absolutely real. When comparing the Quest trailer to potential PC VR builds, we definitely have to worry about compromises. There's the ever-present risk of motion sickness from free flight, the danger of the skies feeling like an empty world, and the simple fact that its official moderate comfort rating might completely isolate brand new VR players.
So the absolutely crucial point is how the developers are mitigating that risk for the consumer. And honestly, that comes down to the price. Compass is launching at a highly accessible base price of just $12.99, with a limited-time pre-order discount dropping it down to $9.99. This aggressive volume over premium pricing strategy drastically lowers the barrier to entry. It makes it incredibly easy for players to just take a chance on this ambitious, potentially game-changing title.
Which leaves us with one final, provocative thought. As the hardware gets better and our virtual worlds get larger, the types of stories we can tell fundamentally change. So I really want to know your take on this. Do you prefer VR games with intense combat and action, or do you think there is a permanent place for purely exploratory, chill VR experiences like Compass? Drop your vote and let me know what you think. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you in the skies.